Before we begin, it is important to note that this episode tackles some difficult subject matters like domestic abuse and coercive control. If this topic feels difficult, then please take care while listening or watching.
Imperfectly, we grow step by step. We let the pain go. In this space, we heal. You know, it's all about the journey, not the show. Living imperfectly, it's true. We rise on our struggles, break through. Together, we'll find something brand new. 'Cause living imperfect is what we do. Imperfectly perfect. Let's go.
Welcome back to Imperfect Chatz. Today's episode is going to be a little different, definitely from our usual conversations. Normally, we talk about relationships, life, mistakes, lessons, all the messy, imperfect parts of being human. But today, we're talking about something that impacts millions across the UK and also around the world. Domestic abuse. So, before we begin, please take breaks while watching or listening to this if you need to. And please remember that this is a very, very challenging set of topics, but it's a conversation that needs to be had nevertheless. This is the PODCASTHON episode for PODCASTHON this year. It seemed only fitting to record in aid of Refuge charity. Refuge is one of the UK's largest organisations supporting survivors of domestic abuse. And domestic abuse is often spoken about in headlines, on the news, etc. But it's important to realise that behind every statistic is a human being that has been impacted by the effects of domestic abuse. Domestic abuse is a very, very complex situation to survive, to get through, navigate. And in the UK, domestic abuse isn't rare. Recent UK statistics point to around 3.8 million adults experience domestic abuse in England and Wales in the year ending March 2023. Think about how many people that is. 1 in 4 women will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. Police receive a domestic abuse related call approximately every 30 seconds. And as I've been recording now, I've been recording for 4 minutes. Think about how many calls that is in 4 minutes alone. On average, a woman is killed by a current or former partner every 5 days. These numbers are incredibly hard to hear. They're hard to read, but they're important because they remind us that there are humans behind every number that are impacted and affected. And it definitely is not an isolated issue. And something that I would like to tackle here is the fact that domestic abuse and violence doesn't necessarily start physical. The abuse takes many, many forms. Domestic abuse can include emotional abuse, coercive control, financial abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, and technology-facilitated abuse. So emotional abuse can look like using sarcasm, blaming, humiliating, criticizing, or even threatening. Coercive control can take many, many forms. It can look like isolation from friends and family. It can look like gaslighting the victim. There's financial abuse, which is where they attempt to take control of bank accounts and spending limits. Psychological abuse, claiming a partner's self-belief and security and their independence. Sexual abuse, which can look like blame, non-consent. Technology facilitated abuse, getting into phones, tracking, and reading text messages and asking, why? Why are you sending them? Why are you getting in touch with them? So the big one here that I'm now going to move on to is understanding coercive control. Coercive control, it's important, is now illegal in the UK, although difficult to prove, because again, it's not bruises, it's not, the scars aren't physical, they're up in here, up in the mind. So coercive control is seen as a pattern of behavior designed to make someone dependent by isolating them, controlling them, and stripping away their independence. So it makes somebody a shell of themselves, ultimately, where they're convinced that they are absolutely on their own. They sometimes have no methods of communication to anyone else. So that can look like controlling finances. As I've already mentioned, this could look like a list of things that their partner has spent money on and budgeting them, and sometimes taking away their bank cards as well. Isolating someone from their friends and family, making them believe that they're better off without them, so that then their only person to talk to is their partner. Monitoring their phone and social media. So this could look like going through their friends list, seeing how much they've contacted a particular person, or even going so far as to hack into their social media if they know their password or email address used. And monitoring their phone could look like how often they called somebody, what they called somebody for, checking the messages, checking to see what they've said between friends, and also like getting into their phones as well, using the 4 numbers or the 6 numbers. I know there's so many numbers that people can use now to get into their phones, or even adding their face on their facial ID or a fingerprint or a thumbprint, as I did there if you're watching online. And then controlling what they wear and where they go, asking them if that is really suitable before they go out, or asking them, where are they going or why are you going there? And threatening self-harm or to harm others when they are questioned on their behavior. And the terrifying thing is that on their own, these behaviors can seem quite flippant and quite small. But when you think about them added up all together and accumulated over weeks, months, years, they add up to be quite a hostile environment and situation. And they're very often used in patterns to create an environment of fear. And I think, again, when we're talking about how important it is to have these conversations and open up discussions around domestic abuse and domestic violence, it's very important to consider the fact that behind everything, behind every action, even though it may sound flippant on its own, behind every number, even though it might sound huge, it sounds huge for a reason, because there are people behind those numbers. There are people who are affected by those actions, no matter how flippant they sound on their own. Research is suggested that economic abuse is experienced by the vast majority of domestic abuse survivors, which affects their ability to leave a situation. safely, meaning that sometimes survivors are on the street if they haven't got enough money set aside to leave a situation that they are currently in. And that's just the real seriousness of the situation here. So, and all this impacts on a person's mental health, their nervous system, how they respond to certain situations, all of it. It's why a lot of the time when people have been through these kinds of situations, they're like a shell of their former self, because certain memories, certain situations, certain texts send them right back to where they were. So now is probably a good time to flag up some things by saying red flag or just simply a bad day. So I'm going to introduce some situations now, and these are scenarios that you may recognize. You may not. So, scenario 1, they get angry when you spend time with friends and they say they just miss you. So, is that an isolation tactic, guilt manipulation, or guilt manipulation? When you spend time with friends, you're lifted out of the situation. You tend to forget the things that go on at home for just a little bit, a little tiny bit of time. And so, yeah, it's normal to ask, where were you? What have you got up to? That kind of thing. But why get angry? Surely if you've got a good partner at home and you can talk to them about anything, you say, yeah, all right, I've just been out with the girls and we had a few drinks or whatever, and it was a laugh. It was fun. And he said, okay. And might want to know more, might be curious about where you went to after that. And why should you feel guilty in that scenario for spending time with your friends? Maybe if you got something arranged previously, but even then you'd still let your partner know. So yeah, it's interesting, that one. It's really interesting how it can play out into isolation and guilt, especially if they're shouting and getting angry. So if that were me, and if that was a build-up of situations and I wasn't due anywhere during like that time with my partner, I'd be turning around and saying, why are you trying to make me feel guilty? Or if it was simply a one-off and they hadn't done it before, they hadn't got angry, and I knew maybe they were going through something, I'd then turn it around and say, okay, it's just a bad day. What's happened? So yeah, these situations and scenarios are very interesting. Okay, so scenario 2. They insist on knowing where you are all the time. So this can look like surveillance behavior. You're under suspicion, like you were doing something that you weren't meant to be, or you were somewhere where they weren't expecting you to be. But this can also look like tech abuse. There's a really interesting advert on TV at the moment. I don't know if anybody has seen it, with the snake coming in through the letterbox when a woman's just got home and she's on her phone, and the snake comes up her arm and curls round, and she's looking at a lot of missed messages from her family and friends. That's the most accurate portrayal of tech abuse that I've seen in a long time. So I think, again, it's okay for them to ask, hey, where have you been? Is everything okay? Have you been up to anything good? Something like that. But I think wanting to know where you are all the time, it definitely leans into tech abuse and the surveillance behavior. It leans into the tech abuse and the surveillance behavior because maybe they've got you on Find My Friends or something like that, something which enables you to be tracked without you necessarily realizing it. Or maybe a person was okay with that initially, because things can change in a relationship. That's the important thing to know here. Things can change. Things can look okay from the outside and then look completely different behind closed doors. And that's what's crucial here. It's to know that there's a clear difference between closed doors and outside. So, scenario 3. They control the money and say it's because they are better with finances. What are we saying with this one? Because obviously, a joint bank account couples sometimes have, and that works out absolutely fine. They run it past each other, what each other spends, they discuss, they talk, fine. But when it comes to feeling guilty about what a partner spends, or maybe they've been out and bought something that wasn't necessarily planned from their own money even, and when that's questioned, when a partner starts writing down a list of things that their other half is spending and calculating a budget, and again controlling the money and maybe asking to borrow money that they know that their partner hasn't got or struggles to get, then it can be termed as abuse. And a statistic here is financial abuse is one of the most common but least recognized forms of abuse. And what very few people realize here is that, as a little reflection, when someone controls your access to money, they're controlling your freedom, your ability to move out of a situation when you know it's not going right, or you know it's damaging your mental health and who you are as a person. So when you think of all 3 scenarios, they control the money because they say they're better with finances. They insist on knowing where you are all the time, and they get angry when you spend time with friends and they say they just miss you. I want you to put those 3 together for a second. See how that would feel. It's tough. It's real tough. And again, that's another reason why these conversations are important to be had, because abuse doesn't always look like bruises. Abuse a lot of the time starts psychological and coercive first. So I'm going to go on to the cycle of abuse next. And it's weird. Most things that we know in life follow a pattern, a type of pattern that we can always rely on, you know, from like the traffic light sequence to the sun coming up and going down each day, the waves coming in and out at the beach. It's all a sequence and a pattern. And I'm going to present this idea to you that the cycle of abuse, the cycle that many abusive relationships follow. And these cycles often follow the same 4 stages: tension building, incident, reconciliation, and a calm period. The calm period can look like everything's fine, everything's settled. Reconciliation, apologizing, making up. The incident where it was apparent that somebody did something wrong. Notice I'm not being too specific there. And tension building. So after harm occurs, there may be apologies, there may be promises to change, or intense affection. And that stage can be really confusing for the survivor, because it can look like, to the survivor, everything's going to be okay. There's light at the end of the tunnel. I'm going to get out of this. But in an abusive relationship, tension comes first. You can tell when something is going to happen. You can almost feel it within your partner because you know them so well. And then the survivor might do the slightest little thing to which their partner interprets as wrong. Absolutely, categorically wrong. And then that'll be the incident. Then there's the reconciliation, which everything can look fine. Survivor says sorry. The abuser says, I'm going to promise to change, or offers intense affection. Then there's that calm period when everything is seemingly back to normal again. And many survivors stay because they believe the person that they love, the person who apologizes, is the real version of their partner. That's the long and short of it. It's that hard and fast, simple. And it's that cycle and that way of thinking and that pattern that's why survivors can't leave. It's not as simple as just leave, just get out. You don't want to be there. Forget it. It's not as simple as that, because a lot of the time, everything in that survivor's world is being controlled and being manipulated. And it's tough. It's so tough to see through that. It's almost like a sticky web in which wherever the survivor looks, there's another strand being woven or being pulled. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the psychological impact that living with that pattern can look like. And domestic abuse has serious mental health effects. Survivors can experience anxiety, where they feel like something's going to go wrong all the time, that if their partner's not around, things seem unsteady and unstable and they can't handle it. Or they're looking for where their partner's going to spring from if they're somewhere where they know that they shouldn't be in their partner's eyes. It can cause depression because their world is closing. It's getting smaller and smaller to the point where sometimes they can feel trapped and isolated. Then they can experience trauma responses, like the flight or fright response, where they start experiencing panic attacks, flashbacks, heart palpitations, all those different things that we associate or can associate with PTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. There we go. I got there in the end. Yay. And then they experience a loss of confidence, a belief that they're not good enough because their self-worth has been stripped and taken away from them by somebody that they respected and they loved. Because that's the key thing here. Survivors do love their partner. It's just not as simple as that because of the cycle of abuse that they live in. And then there's the social isolation, where they've been pulled away from their friends or their family, and they've just got into this little rut that they think is safe with their partner. And it's hard. It's so hard. The one person in the world that you should be able to trust, survivor can't, not fully. But again, they believe that they can trust them because they are going to change one day. And research shows again that domestic abuse significantly increases the risk of mental health difficulties later on, post-abuse. And a little reflection point here is one that I'm going to offer up. When someone repeatedly tells you that you are wrong, rational, or worthless, questioning your decisions, your abilities, the way you are, and your personality, it can change how you see yourself very slowly, but it can still change how you see and view yourself. And then there's another overlooked issue, because very often in relationships, the couple don't often live alone. They have children. And this is so overlooked. And I am so pleased that Refuge recognize the children, because domestic abuse doesn't only affect partners. It affects families, whole families sometimes. And another statistic I have for you here is that around 1 in 5 children in the UK experience domestic abuse within their household. That's 1 in 5 children in the UK. 1 in 5, that's a lot. And as we spoke about earlier on in the podcast, there are people behind that statistic that are affected. And children exposed to domestic abuse situations may experience emotional distress where sometimes they may not want to go back home particularly if there's a lot of shouting, arguing, heated discussions, or there's a bad atmosphere that they can pick up on instinctively, as children can. There's behavioral difficulties that they may have. Particularly they can act out if there's real bad problems at home. Difficulties in school, such as not concentrating, not being able to keep up with schoolwork. So they'll experience educational difficulties, difficulties in making friends and keeping them. There's so much to consider here, and it's just so outrageous to me why it's overlooked, because it really truly shouldn't be. And then, of course, there's a long-term trauma as well. There's what that can do to a child that's been living in that environment that's so intense, and that the fact that they've been living there for so long in that situation, and they've seen their parents, heard their parents yelling, even when they might have been told to stay out of the room or put their headphones on, or something, they'll have known that something is happening. And something that isn't so important to note here is that children do not need to witness physical violence to be affected. Living in a home with fear and control can still have profound effects, even when the child is away somewhere in the room, or listening to music, or watching something else on TV or Netflix. It's still the tension in the environment and the feeling that something could happen at any point. So I touched on this loosely earlier on in the episode, but leaving an abusive relationship is complicated. And one of the most common questions that somebody always asks a survivor is, why don't you just leave? There are several different realities as to why somebody can't just pack up the bags and leave. One is financial barriers. Many survivors, as I've already discussed, have limited access to money. And even though it's limited, it may still be watched by their partner. There could also be housing barriers. Domestic abuse is one of the largest contributors to homelessness among women, and sometimes children as well, because maybe they've bought a house together, maybe they've rented a house together, and they're both on the agreement. That's another subject that a survivor has to consider before they leave. Then there are the safety risks, and leaving a domestic abusive relationship can be one of the most dangerous moments when a survivor potentially has to confront their abusive partner with the decision that they've made. And emotional ties as well, because depending how long the survivor has been with their partner, relationships involve love, history, different things that they've been through together as a partnership, and family, especially if they've been together long enough that their families are now entwined and they consider each other one huge family. That can be so traumatic. And the reality of it is, survivors often spend months or years planning how to leave safely. So there's a lot in that. There's a lot to unpack, and you can see why it takes months or even years to leave, because there's so much to take into consideration. especially when she might be aware that her safety is at risk, or her children or child might be at risk. So there's a lot to plan and get a head round. And that's where the wonderful charity of Refuge come in. And I am so grateful that I've been able to do this episode with them, because the work that they do is nothing short of fabulous. So let me take you through what a gorgeous charity Refuge is. And Refuge provides emergency accommodation. They take the time to sort out accommodation if a woman is left without a house to go to or a home to go to after leaving an abusive relationship. They contact specialist domestic abuse support workers to support survivors through the tough times that they will go through after leaving an abusive relationship from a partner. They will also advocate for them legally and be able to decipher the many different challenges when it comes to legal systems here in the UK. They also do economic empowerment services, where they are able to make sure that the survivor gets back on their feet after having their finances controlled. There's also technology abuse support, which is where they help the survivor gain back independent access over their technology that's being controlled. Refuge really is a one-stop support all service and charity, but it can't carry on without your support. They also operate a national domestic abuse helpline, which I will leave the details in the description of this episode, as well as a fundraising link for you to donate to Refuge through Imperfect Chatz as part of the PODCASTHON. These services that Refuge provide save. So, my wonderful listeners, what can you do? You can donate to Refuge, as I've already said, using the donation link in the description below. Share the information about domestic abuse. As you've probably seen across social media with Imperfect Chatz, I have been going mad sharing statistics in the run-up to the release of this podcast. So please take your time to go through those and share them. Widen the conversation, deepen the conversation. Let's reduce the stigma surrounding talking about domestic abuse and violence. Check in with your friends. Make sure that they're okay. If they're going through something, give them the space that they need to feel like they are listened to and heard, and challenge the harmful myths surrounding domestic abuse and violence. Make sure that people are heard. Make sure that people are seen. Make sure that nobody suffers in silence. And as well, if you need the domestic abuse helpline, it's available 24 hours a day and is fully confidential. And it's available at 0808 2 000 247. Again, I will leave it up on the screen and in the description box below. And as a final reflection from me, Imperfect Chatz has always been about having honest conversations. And I'm sure that you can all agree that this podcast episode has been no different. Sometimes those conversations that we share can be really uncomfortable, but they're uncomfortable for a reason. They're uncomfortable because they matter. Domestic abuse thrives in silence. Talking about it helps people recognize it, challenge it, and ultimately stop it. If something that you heard today feels familiar, please know that there are people ready to help. The right people will always listen, and you deserve safety. Everybody is entitled to safety. As always, thank you so much to everybody for listening. Please take the time to share, follow, subscribe, leave Imperfect Chatz a review from wherever you've been listening to this episode from. A massive thank you from me to Refuge for allowing me to create this wonderful episode and open up the conversation even more when it comes to domestic abuse and violence. Until next time, I'll see you later. Bye for now.
Imperfectly, perfectly, we grow step by step, we let